He thought he had bought a pile of useless junk for pennies, but as soon as he opened the container, his life changed forever. No one could have predicted what was hidden inside. Subscribe and write where you are watching this video from. Mark sat on the edge of his bed staring at the floor as the pale morning light slipped through the blinds. The apartment smelled faintly of yesterday's dinner, and the air was heavy with silence. His wife had already left for work, her absence hanging in the room like an accusation. On the dresser, an unopened bill with red lettering reminded him of everything he had been unable to fix. His reflection in the mirror across the room startled him for a moment, gray threading his hair, lines carved deeper into his forehead than he remembered. He was only in his 40s, yet life had already managed to make him look older. His hands bore the calluses of years of hard labor, but there was no sense of accomplishment in them, only fatigue. Work was steady but unrewarding. He loaded trucks at a warehouse where no one remembered his name unless they needed something done quickly. The paycheck barely stretched to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and the endless cycle of small debts that piled up over the years. The credit card balances grew like weeds, and the thought of paying them off seemed laughable. At home, his wife had grown tired of words without solutions. She spoke less to him now, her glances sharp and cold. Their daughter, a teenager on the brink of adulthood, rarely invited friends over, too embarrassed perhaps by the peeling paint on the apartment walls or the secondhand furniture. Mark was not lazy, nor a man who had squandered his life in drink or gambling. He had tried to be steady, tried to hold everything together. But somewhere along the way, opportunities had slipped through his fingers, and now he stood at a cliff's edge, staring down into a void of sameness that promised no escape. Every day bled into the next with frightening predictability, and yet despite the crushing weight of reality, a spark of longing still flickered inside him. He wanted more. Not extravagance or luxury, just a chance to breathe without the constant choke of bills and debt. It was on one of those weary afternoons at the warehouse that he overheard two co-workers talking. They laughed about an auction one of them had attended, bragging about a lucky find inside a storage container that had cost only a fraction of its worth. "People just walk away from them," one man said. "Don't pay rent, forget about it, or lose track. Then the facility sells off the whole thing. Sometimes you get junk, but sometimes—" His voice trailed off with the kind of grin that hinted at riches. Mark pretended not to listen, but the words lodged deep in his mind. That night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling as his wife's steady breathing filled the dark. Storage auctions. The idea seemed ridiculous. Who would leave behind anything valuable? Surely the talk was exaggerated, one of those tall tales men tell to make life sound more adventurous than it really is. Still, the thought gnawed at him. If others could stumble upon treasure, why not him? Even a small stroke of luck could change everything. He had no savings, but he still had a sliver of credit and a dangerous willingness to gamble. The following week, Mark found himself driving toward the edge of town, where rows of storage units stretched like an endless corridor of forgotten lives. He had read about the process. The doors would be rolled up for a few seconds, bidders allowed only a glimpse inside without touching anything, and then the auctioneer would start calling numbers. It was all about instinct, luck, and the willingness to risk money on a mystery. Mark parked his dented car between two shiny trucks, feeling instantly out of place. The other bidders looked seasoned, moving with an air of casual confidence. They talked loudly, trading stories of past finds and laughing at rookies who had wasted cash on worthless trash. Mark tried to appear calm, but his heart hammered in his chest. He walked among them, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, eyes darting nervously from face to face. The air was brisk, and he could smell the faint tang of rust and dust as the auctioneer prepared to begin. The first few units were opened quickly. Inside one, only moldy boxes and broken furniture. Another contained stacks of old magazines, a rusted lawnmower, and nothing else. The bidding was quick, casual, and far higher than Mark was willing to risk. He stood at the edge, feeling foolish, wondering if he should just leave and save himself the embarrassment. Then it happened. A worker rolled up the door of a container, its hinges groaning as if reluctant to reveal the secret within. The unit was old, its frame speckled with rust, the paint flaking like dead skin. Inside, shadows obscured most of the space, but a few objects caught his eye. A broken bicycle leaned against a cabinet with missing doors. A sagging armchair slouched in the corner. A couple of cardboard boxes sat stacked against the wall, their tops caved in from weight and damp. There was nothing remarkable about it, nothing to inspire a frenzy. The crowd shuffled impatiently, a few muttering that it was a waste of time. But Mark lingered. Something about the neglected look, the way the items seemed thrown together and abandoned, struck him differently. While others dismissed it as worthless, he felt a strange pull. Perhaps it was desperation whispering in his ear, telling him to take the chance. Or perhaps it was instinct, that quiet voice inside that occasionally steers a man toward destiny. The auctioneer's voice boomed out, calling the opening bid. It was the lowest of the day, a token sum. Silence met the offer. The regulars weren't interested. Mark swallowed hard, his palms damp. He hesitated, then raised his hand. The eyes of the crowd turned toward him, some smirking, others barely acknowledging him at all. "Do I hear another bid?" the auctioneer barked. No one spoke. No one moved. "Sold!" The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the crowd dispersed as quickly as they had gathered, already eager for the next unit. Mark stood rooted to the spot, the weight of what he had just done pressing down on him. The container was his now, his for almost nothing, yet perhaps worth even less. He wasn't sure whether to laugh at his foolishness or tremble at the thought of what he might find. As the noise of the auction faded down the row, Mark remained by the rusted door, staring into the dim space that was now his responsibility. Dust floated lazily in the beams of light slipping past the frame. He took a deep breath, the smell of mildew thick in his lungs, and stepped closer. His future, uncertain and precarious, now rested inside a forgotten metal box that no one else had wanted. For the first time in a long while, Mark felt the faint stirrings of possibility. He had no idea whether he had just wasted his last chance or opened a door to something that would change his life forever. But as he reached for the lock and prepared to claim what was his, a strange shiver of anticipation ran down his spine. Somewhere beneath the dust and shadows, hidden in the wreckage of discarded things, something waited for him. And with that thought, he stepped into the darkness. The silence inside the container seemed to close in around Mark the moment the last footsteps of the dispersing crowd faded away. He stood just inside the doorway, eyes adjusting to the gloom. The first impression was worse than he had expected. Dust lay thick on every surface, the air heavy and stale with the smell of mildew and neglect. A broken cabinet leaned precariously against the wall, one door hanging from a single rusted hinge, the other missing altogether. A child's bicycle, its paint chipped and the tires flat, rested sideways on the floor, as if it had collapsed there years ago and never been touched again. Against the far wall, an old armchair sagged under the weight of time, its upholstery torn and stuffing spilling out like yellowed clouds. Mark's heart sank as he took it all in. It looked like nothing more than the cast-offs of a life long forgotten. He ran a hand over his face, smearing dust across his skin, and exhaled heavily. He had hoped for something, anything, that might justify even the small sum he had spent. But this was barely worth hauling to a junkyard. He considered walking away, admitting to himself that he had wasted his money, but some stubborn part of him wouldn't let go. He hadn't come here for nothing. He forced himself deeper inside, weaving through the cramped aisles between broken furniture and collapsed cardboard. His footsteps stirred the dust into lazy spirals that danced in the thin shafts of light from the doorway. At first, it was all as hopeless as it appeared. He nudged aside boxes filled with old clothes, the fabric eaten through by moths and time. A suitcase with a broken handle held nothing but brittle newspapers and a pair of cracked shoes. Each discovery brought another pang of disappointment, each second strengthening the voice in his head that told him he had been a fool. Then in the back corner, half hidden beneath a stack of warped wooden planks, he noticed something different. A set of large crates, rectangular and heavy, their wood stained dark with age, sat stacked one atop another. They were not the ordinary kind of cardboard or plastic containers people used to store junk. These had been carefully constructed, the corners reinforced with metal brackets, the lids nailed shut long ago. The sight of them jolted him from his despair. They did not belong to the randomness of the rest of the clutter. They had purpose. Mark crouched in front of the nearest crate, brushing dust and cobwebs away with trembling fingers. His pulse quickened. Whoever had left these had wanted them sealed, protected. With a piece of broken metal from the bicycle frame, he began prying at the lid. The nails resisted, groaning as if protesting against the disturbance, until finally one side gave way with a sharp crack. He pulled harder, the wood splintering until the lid came loose. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Inside, nestled in faded cloth, were small leather pouches, each one heavy and bulging. He lifted one carefully, the weight solid and undeniable, and tugged open the drawstring. His eyes widened as coins spilled into his palm, golden discs glinting dully through a layer of tarnish and dust. They were old, their surfaces etched with unfamiliar designs, worn smooth at the edges, but unmistakably valuable. Gold. Real gold. For a long moment he sat frozen, staring at the treasure in his hand. His disbelief was so strong that he half expected the coins to dissolve into dust, to vanish and leave him clutching nothing but air. But they remained cold and heavy against his skin. His chest tightened, a strange pressure between exhilaration and fear. He tipped the pouch further, and more coins slid out, clinking softly as they piled on the floor. His breath came in shallow gasps as he turned back to the crate. Beneath the pouches of coins lay other objects wrapped in cloth and paper. He unfolded one to reveal a silver goblet, its surface tarnished but ornate, the stem engraved with intricate patterns that caught even the dim light. Another bundle revealed a necklace, delicate but radiant, its chain fine as thread, its pendant set with a gemstone the color of deep water. His hands trembled so badly he nearly dropped it. The floodgates of disbelief burst open, and Mark began tearing into the other crates with frantic urgency. Each one revealed more wonders. There were paintings carefully wrapped in yellowed fabric, the frames gilded though chipped, the brushstrokes vibrant despite their age. A collection of books bound in cracked leather, their spines embossed with fading gold lettering, exuded the faint smell of ink and time. In one crate he found stacks of envelopes bound together with twine, each stuffed with what appeared to be rare stamps, each design more intricate than the last. Every discovery pulled him further from despair and deeper into awe. The dust that had seemed suffocating before now felt like a veil lifting, revealing riches hidden in plain sight. He was no longer in a forgotten storage container, but a vault of history, a treasure trove that had waited silently for someone bold or desperate enough to claim it. Yet even as joy surged through him, unease gnawed at the edges of his mind. These things were not random. Someone had cared for them, preserved them, hidden them with intention. Who? And why had they been left here to rot? He glanced at the armchair. the bicycle, the broken cabinet, and realized they had been a disguise, a camouflage to hide the true worth of what lay behind them. Still kneeling, he picked up one of the envelopes lying at the bottom of a crate. It was brittle with age, its paper yellowed and edges curled. He held it close to the faint light and saw handwriting in elegant script. The address was faded, but he could make out a name. His throat tightened as the realization struck him. These were not just objects, not just wealth. They were pieces of a life, fragments of a family's history packed away and forgotten. Mark sat back on his heels, coins and dust scattered across the floor around him. His hands shook as he tried to take in the magnitude of what he had uncovered. Riches beyond anything he had ever imagined were suddenly his, lying in heaps at his feet. Yet for every rush of exhilaration, there was an equal wave of dread. Why was it here? Why had no one come back for it? He tried to imagine the kind of person who would own such things, who would tuck away gold and silver, art and documents into wooden crates and leave them behind. A collector, a family with a long lineage, or perhaps someone fleeing from something, someone who had no chance to return. For hours he sifted through the crates, touching, cataloging in his mind, convincing himself that what he saw was real. By the time exhaustion set in, he was surrounded by little piles of artifacts, each one telling a different story, each one proof that his life had just veered sharply away from the bleak path it had followed. And yet, as he leaned against the container wall, staring at the glitter of coins scattered across the dirty floor, he could not silence the unease. He had found treasure, yes, but he had also found the ghost of someone else's life. A ghost that, for reasons he did not yet understand, had been abandoned to rot in a rusting metal box. That night, long after he dragged some of the smaller items into his car and drove home, the images haunted him. The glint of gold in the lamplight, the fragile paper of the letters, the paintings hidden in dusty wraps, all replayed in his mind like fragments of a dream. He had wanted a miracle, and now he had one. But as he lay awake, his wife breathing steadily beside him, he felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. Wealth beyond imagining had fallen into his hands, yet it came with questions that twisted his excitement into something darker. He had uncovered treasures in the dust, but what he had truly unearthed remained hidden. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a whisper told him that this discovery was only the beginning. Sleep eluded Mark in the days that followed his discovery. The gold coins, the silver goblets, the paintings and books, all of it seemed too extraordinary to be real. And yet there they were, hidden away in his garage like an unspoken secret that grew heavier with every passing hour. He found himself returning to the boxes late at night when the rest of the household was quiet, as though compelled by a force beyond his control. At first, he only wanted to reassure himself that the treasure had not disappeared, that he had not dreamed it into existence. But soon the compulsion deepened. He wanted to understand it, to piece together the story behind these objects that seemed to hum with the echoes of another life. The documents and letters became his starting point. By the dim light of a lamp, he sorted through brittle envelopes, unfolding pages that crackled at the edges. The handwriting varied from one letter to another, sometimes elegant and flowing, sometimes hurried and jagged, but always filled with emotion. Many were written in an older style of language, the ink faded but still legible. They spoke of family affairs, arguments over property, disputes with neighbors, and sometimes more personal matters, a quarrel between siblings, a marriage that was not approved by everyone, debts that mounted faster than anyone could pay them. As he read, he felt as if he were intruding on lives that had long since ended. One letter described the loss of a family estate after years of litigation. Another hinted at betrayal, a relative who had sold off land that had been promised to others. There were notes of bitterness, of sorrow, of hope clinging stubbornly against despair. Each page carried not just words but the weight of human struggle. Among the papers were photographs, their edges curling and yellowing with time. Some were small, faded portraits of solemn-faced men and women dressed in clothing that belonged to another era. Others showed gatherings in gardens or parlors, families smiling stiffly into the camera, children with bows in their hair or sailors in uniform. Mark studied their faces, searching for resemblances, for signs of who these people had been, and why their belongings had ended up abandoned in a storage container. The more he uncovered, the more unease settled in his chest. These were not mere possessions. They were fragments of a family saga, once cherished and fiercely protected, now reduced to relics covered in dust. Each discovery made the treasure feel less like a miracle and more like a burden. He had come seeking fortune, but what he had found was responsibility. At work, he could hardly concentrate. The hum of forklifts and the clatter of pallets faded behind the roar of his own thoughts. His co-workers laughed and cursed around him, but he was somewhere else, reliving lines of letters he had read the night before. When he returned home, the first thing he wanted to do was shut himself away in the garage, sorting, reading, piecing together the fragments of history like a man assembling a puzzle with missing pieces. Yet with every night that passed, shadows seemed to lengthen in his mind. Sometimes he caught himself glancing over his shoulder on the way to his car, convinced that someone was watching him. A pair of strangers loitering near the storage facility one evening sent a chill down his spine. They might have been harmless, simply waiting for a ride, but he felt their eyes on him and hurried past without looking back. Fear began to mingle with his fascination. He asked himself over and over why such wealth had been left behind. No one forgets coins of gold or paintings wrapped so carefully. No one abandons heirlooms unless something greater than neglect has forced their hand. Had the family perished? Had they been driven out or ruined by debts? Or was there something darker, that the treasure had been hidden deliberately and perhaps others were still searching for it? The nights grew longer as his mind refused to quiet. He would sit at the small desk in the garage, letters spread out before him, the soft gleam of coins and goblets at the edge of his vision. His fingers traced the faded ink while his thoughts spiraled between greed and guilt. On one hand, the wealth could transform his life. No more debt, no more anxious calculations over rent and groceries, no more arguments with his wife about bills. He could finally give his daughter the stability he had failed to provide. But on the other hand, none of it had ever been his. He had not earned it. He had stumbled into it by chance, like a thief who discovered an unlocked door. The weight of this moral dilemma pressed down on him like a physical force. At times he tried to convince himself with the law. He had bought the container fairly, under the rules of the auction. The contents were now his by right. But then he would unfold a letter signed with a trembling hand, or gaze into the eyes of a child frozen forever in a sepia photograph, and the certainty dissolved. These were not mere objects to be bartered or sold. They were lives, histories, legacies. Sleep became an enemy. When he closed his eyes, he saw those faces from the photographs staring at him, wordless and solemn. He saw hands reaching out for what was theirs, only to vanish into the dust that now covered their memory. He would jolt awake drenched in sweat, the silence of the night broken only by the sound of his own breath. His wife stirred occasionally, asking if something was wrong, but he had no words to explain. How could he tell her that the fortune they needed had fallen into his lap? Yet it came shackled with chains of doubt and fear. One evening, as he bent over a pile of papers, he heard a noise outside the garage. A rustle, perhaps only the wind, but it sent his heart racing. He turned off the lamp, holding his breath, ears straining in the darkness. For a moment he was sure someone was there. watching, waiting. When he finally dared to open the door, the yard lay empty, shadows stretching across the grass. Still the feeling lingered, and he could not shake the sense of eyes upon him. The paranoia grew day by day, and until it seemed to cling to him wherever he went. On the street, he imagined strangers turning to follow him with their gaze. At work, he felt whispers in the break room cut short when he entered, though in truth his co-workers paid him no more attention than usual. The treasure had begun to change him, to consume him. By the time another week passed, he had nearly forgotten the excitement of that first discovery. The gold no longer glowed with promise, but glared at him with accusation. The letters whispered at him, their words of loss and betrayal echoing in his thoughts. And in the middle of it all, he sat surrounded by wealth he could neither abandon nor claim without tearing himself apart. On a sleepless night near dawn, Mark sat alone in the garage, staring at the scattered coins that reflected the faint light like fragments of a shattered sun. His hands shook as he pressed them together, his face buried in his palms. The treasure had been hidden for a reason. Perhaps it had been cursed by misfortune, or perhaps simply by the lives it had once belonged to. Whatever the truth, he felt the shadow of it seeping into his own life now, wrapping around him like a tightening coil. As the first light of morning crept under the garage door, he whispered aloud for the first time the thought that had haunted him since the moment he pried open that first crate. He had not found freedom. He had found a prison made of gold. And yet, even as dread filled him, he knew he would not walk away. Something inside him clung to the discovery with desperate hands, unwilling to let it go. He was caught between the promise of salvation and the pull of the past, trapped in a web woven long before his time. The shadows of the past had claimed him, and there was no turning back. The nights had grown unbearably long for Mark. He no longer measured time by days at the warehouse or evenings at home with his family, but by the hours he spent in the garage staring at the hoard that seemed both his salvation and his curse. The treasure had not left his thoughts for a moment since he discovered it. Even at work, the clang of machinery and shouts of men faded into a distant hum while his mind replayed the faces in those faded photographs and the words in the trembling letters. He could not walk away from them, nor could he shake the conviction that he had been entrusted by accident or fate with something that demanded a choice. It was after one particularly restless night that he rose before dawn and sat at the kitchen table with a pile of letters spread out before him. The apartment was silent, his wife and daughter still asleep, the only sound the ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. He held one envelope under the weak light, running his finger along the faded script of a name. The surname appeared again and again across the documents, sometimes on deeds, sometimes on legal papers, sometimes in personal letters that told stories of quarrels and estrangements. A family that had once owned much, that much was clear, but one that had been torn apart by conflict and loss. For the first time, Mark resolved to do more than simply marvel at the fragments of history he had unearthed. He needed answers. He needed to know if anyone remained, if there were living heirs who had any claim to what lay in his garage. It was not the law that compelled him. By the law, the contents of the container were his, fair and square. But the law had become a hollow shield against the nagging voice of conscience. He could not silence the thought that he was clutching at ghosts, that the fortune before him was a legacy meant for someone else. He began cautiously, looking up names in old directories, searching archives at the library, tracing addresses long abandoned. Each lead seemed to vanish into the past. Some names appeared in obituaries, their lives extinguished decades ago. Others had moved, married, and vanished into new identities. It was like chasing shadows. Yet the more he searched, the deeper his resolve grew. He would not be at peace until he knew the truth of what he had stumbled upon. Still, temptation hovered at the edge of his determination. Each night when he returned to the garage, he would sit among the coins and goblets, the paintings and books, and wonder what it would be like to claim them fully. He could imagine the freedom of paying every debt, of leaving behind the warehouse with its endless shifts, of giving his daughter the chance at a better future. The wealth gleamed at him with a promise so bright it was blinding, and yet the more he reached for it in his thoughts, the more it seemed to burn his hands, reminding him that it was not truly his to take without cost. That conflict hollowed him. He became restless at home, snapping at his wife over trivial matters, distracted when his daughter spoke to him. They noticed the change, but he could not tell them why. How could he speak of gold hidden in crates, of letters written by dead hands, of the heavy choice pressing down on him? To say it aloud would make it real, and he was not ready for that. Then came the discovery that altered everything. In one of the bundles of documents, folded within an envelope sealed with a broken wax stamp, he found what appeared to be the outline of a will. It was not complete, not signed by witnesses, perhaps only a draft, but it listed names, estates, and divisions of property. The handwriting trembled as if written in haste or under duress. At the bottom in fading ink was a phrase that caught him. If no rightful heir may be found, let it remain in trust, not to be squandered. The words shook him more deeply than any gleam of gold. They seemed to speak directly to him, to his own heart. Was he not now the keeper of that trust? Was it not fate that had led him to this forgotten container? Yet even as the thought rose, so too did doubt. To keep the wealth as his own would be to betray the intention of those who had hidden it. To give it all away would be to betray his own family, who needed him to be more than the man who could barely pay bills. He wrestled with that dilemma until his nerves frayed. Sleep brought only nightmares, figures in sepia photographs stepping out of the shadows, accusing him with silent eyes. Coins spilling like sand through his fingers, no matter how tightly he tried to hold them. During the day, strangers' faces seemed to linger on him a beat too long, feeding his paranoia that someone else knew, that someone else was waiting to claim what he had found. One evening, after hours of pacing the garage, Mark came to a decision. He would not hoard it all, nor would he surrender it completely. He would split it fairly, cleanly, as though dividing not just gold, but the burden itself. Half he would keep, to give his family the life they deserved after years of scraping by. Half he would set aside, and if ever rightful heirs appeared, that portion would be theirs. It was not perfect justice, but it was a balance he could live with. The next morning, with a clarity he had not felt in weeks, he began the process of separating the treasure. He laid out coins and goblets in two piles, sorted paintings and books, divided documents into what was personal history and what was valuable property. Each division felt like a cut into his own flesh. Yet with each cut, he felt the weight on his chest ease slightly. He was not free, but he was no longer trapped. He had chosen, and the choice gave him strength. Still, doubts lingered like shadows at the edges of light. Was half enough? Would his compromise satisfy the unseen judgment of those who had once owned these things? Or had he merely carved the burden into two equal pieces, one to carry in his hands, the other to haunt his conscience forever? As weeks turned to months, Mark's life changed. He paid off debts quietly, avoiding sudden extravagance that might draw attention. He repaired the apartment, bought his daughter new clothes, eased the constant tension that had strained his marriage. His wife noticed the difference, though he never told her everything. She saw only that the man who had once been worn thin by hopelessness now walked with a firmer step. But in the quiet hours, when the house slept and the city outside hushed, Mark would return to the garage and sit before the divided piles. The coins still gleamed, the letters still whispered, the faces in the photographs still stared. He had chosen a path, but it was not an ending. It was the beginning of a life bound forever to a secret, a life shaped by a discovery that was both miracle and burden. The container had promised fortune, and it had delivered more than he could have imagined. But it had also given him something else, something far harder to measure: the weight of history, the test of conscience, the trial of fate. And as he sat in the dim light, watching shadows dance across the gold, Mark knew that though he had divided the treasure, he could never divide himself from it. It would remain with him always, a reminder that chance can lift a man to heights he never dreamed, but never without a price. And so the story of a forgotten container became the story of his life, not a tale of riches won or lost, but of a man forced to choose between greed and honor, between the ghosts of the past and the fragile hope of the future. Whatever lay ahead, his destiny was no longer the slow decline he had once feared. It was uncertain, perilous, but undeniably his. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Click now to watch the next video and dive even deeper into shocking discoveries. And if this story left you stunned, share it with your friends. They won't believe what's inside.